Imagine you're standing behind a wall of barbed wire in the middle of a Kansas heat wave. You are an officer of the Third Reich, a member of the most disciplined army the world has ever. You have been told your entire life that you are superior, that your enemies are weak, and that America is a nation of starving peasants. But as you stand there in 1944, you see something that makes you laugh out loud. You see American soldiers roasting ears of corn over an open flame. You turn to your fellow prisoners and mock them. In Germany, corn is for swine. It is for cattle. It is the lowest form of animal fodder. You shout at the guards, asking if they have run out of real food. You feel a sense of triumph, believing the American supply lines have finally collapsed. But then, a sergeant walks up to the fence and hands you a steaming, buttered ear of corn. You take one bite, and in that single second, your heart sinks. Your pride shatters. You realize that what you called animal food tastes better than the finest rations in Berlin. This wasn't just a snack. It was a psychological weapon that proved the war was already over. The sun over Camp Concordia, Kansas, was a relentless weight. For the German women held their mostly elite signals officers, captured during the collapse of the front. The heat was a physical reminder of their defeat. They were thousands of miles from home, yet they maintained a rigid, icy discipline. They marched in formation. They kept their uniforms as neat as possible, and they looked at their American captors with pure, unadulterated contempt. To these women, the Americans were aimless, unrefined. They believed the propaganda they had been fed for years, that Germany was the pinnacle of civilization, and America was a disorganized mess of immigrants who couldn't possibly sustain a long-term war effort. On this particular afternoon, the air was thick with a new scent. It was smoky, sweet, and rich. In the mess yard, the American GIs were preparing a feast, but to the Germans, it looked like an insult. They watched as crates of fresh corn, still in their green husks, were piled high. In Germany, corn was Kukuruse, a crop used only for silage. It was what you fed to pigs to fatten them up for slaughter. The sight of soldiers' men who had defeated them in battle, preparing to eat this garbage, gave the prisoners a sudden surge of confidence. They stood at the wire, shouting insults. They made pig noises. They laughed at the poverty of the United States. They convinced themselves that the Americans were so desperate, so low on wheat and rye, that they had been reduced to eating the scrapings of the barn floor. But the laughter was a mask for a much darker reality. Back in Germany, the situation was dire. By 1944, the average German citizen was eating Ersatz, bread, a dark, heavy loaf stretched out with sawdust, potato starch, and barley. Real butter had disappeared years ago. The German people were starving in silence, while their leaders promised them a victory that was never coming. The women in the camp knew this, even if they wouldn't admit it. Their stomachs were used to the cramping ache of scarcity. So, when the scent of the roasting corn hit them, it triggered a primal response that their ideology couldn't suppress. A young American sergeant named Miller noticed the mocking laughter. He didn't get angry. He didn't reach for his rifle. Instead, he did something far more devastating. He pulled an ear of corn from the grill, peeled back the blackened husks to reveal the glistening, golden kernels underneath, and smeared it with a thick slab of yellow butter. He walked straight to the fence where the most vocal German officer, a woman named Helga, was standing. He held it out through the wire. The silence that fell over the yard was absolute. Helga looked at the corn, then at the sergeant. To take it was to admit she was hungry. To eat it was to participate in a primitive American act. For a long moment, the pride of the Third Reich held firm. But then, the heat, the smoke, and the sheer abundance of the gesture broke her. She reached out and took the ear of corn. It was hot, heavy, and smelled like a dream of a world without war. She took a bite. The explosion of sweetness was a shock to her system. It wasn't the dry, mealy texture of field corn. This was sweet corn, a hybrid marvel of American agriculture. The butter and salt coated her tongue, providing a richness she hadn't experienced in years. She stopped chewing. Her eyes darted to her fellow officers, who were watching her with a mix of horror and intense curiosity. She didn't say a word, but her expression told them everything. The animal food was a delicacy. The starving Americans were eating better than the German high command. Realization was a physical blow. If the Americans could afford to grow this much food, and if their lowest food was this good, then every piece of propaganda Helga had ever heard was a lie. She wasn't looking at a desperate enemy. She was looking at a superpower that had so much surplus they didn't know what to do with it. The sergeant saw the change in her face. He smiled a small, knowing smile. He told her that this was just a tiny fraction of what was growing outside the fences. He told her that in Kansas alone, the fields of corn stretched for hundreds of miles, enough to feed the world. One by one, the other women stepped forward. The mocking laughter died, replaced by the sound of husks being torn away. They ate in a sort of desperate silence, realizing that their superiority was a hollow shell. They had been captured by a nation that could turn a pig's snack into a feast. As the sun began to set over the Kansas prairie, the German prisoners didn't feel like soldiers anymore. They felt like children who had been told a fairy tale about a monster, only to find out the monster was actually a giant with a golden garden. But the real shock was yet to come. The sergeant told them that tomorrow they wouldn't be staying in the camp. They were being taken out into the heart of the Kansas farm country. They were going to see the machines that harvested this gold. They were going to see the families who lived on this land. For Helga and the others, the fear of the unknown began to mix with a strange, forbidden excitement. If the corn was this good, what else had the Americans been hiding? They went to their barracks that night with a taste of sugar and butter still on their lips, their minds racing with the terrifying possibility that the world they thought they knew didn't exist at all. The sun rose the next morning not with the soft gray light of Europe, but with a blinding, aggressive brilliance that turned the Kansas horizon into a line of liquid gold. For Helga and the other German women, the taste of the roasted corn from the night before was still a ghost on their tongues, a lingering sweetness that felt like a betrayal of their training. As the heavy transport trucks rattled to a halt inside the camp gates, the atmosphere was thick with a new kind of tension. They weren't being moved to another prison. They were being moved into the heart of the machine. They climbed onto the wooden benches of the trucks, their backs straight, eyes forward, still clinging to the remnants of their military bearing. But as the convoy rolled out of the gates of Cape Concordia and onto the dirt roads of the open prairie, their discipline began to fray. They had expected to see a landscape scarred by war factories, smoke, and the frantic, exhausted movement of a nation struggling to survive. Instead, they saw peace. They saw miles and miles of green and gold, an ocean of corn stalks taller than a man, swaying in the wind like a salute to the sky. The trucks pulled into the Schmidt farm, a sprawling 300-acre estate that looked more like a kingdom than a family plot. At the gate stood Wilhelm Schmidt, a man with a weathered face and hands like cracked leather. He greeted the prisoners not with a sneer, but with a simple nod. He spoke a few words of German, a dialect passed down from his grandfather, which hit the women like a physical blow. This enemy was not a stranger. He was a mirror of their own ancestors, transplanted into a land of impossible plenty. Then they saw the machinery. In Germany, the pride of the nation was its panzers and its U-boats. But here, on a quiet farm in the middle of nowhere, stood a different kind of titan. A massive combine harvester sat in the yard, its blades gleaming, a hulking beast of steel and gears. To the German women, who were used to seeing farming done by hand, or with the help of weary horses, this machine looked like something out of a science fiction novel. Wilhelm climbed into the seat. The engine roared to life with a guttural, powerful throb, and he drove it straight into the field. The women watched, paralyzed, as the machine devoured rows of corn in seconds. What would have taken 100 German peasants an entire day of back-breaking labor was being completed by one man in minutes. The efficiency was cold. It was relentless. Anneliese, a sharp-tongued intelligence clerk who had been the loudest mocker the day before, whispered to Helga, "We work all day for a single bushel. This man clears a field before lunch. How can we fight this?" The statistics they had been taught back home were lies. They were told American industry was a myth, that their factories were empty and their people were weak. But as they stood in the dust of the Schmidt farm, they realized the truth was far worse than any bomb. America wasn't just producing weapons. They were producing the fuel that allowed them to ignore the exhaustion of war. Wilhelm's wife, a sturdy woman with a kind smile, walked out to the field carrying a tin pail of cold water. She handed it to the prisoners. For women who were used to suspicion, who expected to be treated with the same cruelty they had seen the Reich inflict on others, this hospitality was disarming. It was a psychological ambush. They had been prepared for hatred. They were not prepared for being treated like neighbors. At noon, the lesson moved from the fields to the farm kitchen. The women were invited to sit at long wooden tables under the shade of a massive oak tree. The spread laid out before them was a sensory overload. There was cornbread, golden and crumbling with moisture. There were corn fritters fried in deep oil until they were crisp. There was a thick, creamy corn pudding that smelled of vanilla and nutmeg. Helga picked up a piece of cornbread. She remembered the black, sour rye bread of the fatherland, the bread that felt like a stone in the stomach. She bit into the cornbread. It was light. It was airy. It tasted like freedom from hunger. She looked at the Schmidt children, who were running through the yard, their pockets stuffed with popcorn kernels, laughing as if there wasn't a world-shattering war happening 10,000 miles away. In that moment, the paradox became unbearable. Germany had sacrificed everything, its youth, its resources, its soul, to conquer the world in search of Lebensraum, living space. Yet here, in a country they had been told was inferior, there was so much space and so much food that even the birds were fat. The Americans didn't need to conquer anyone. They already had everything. We were told they were starving, Annalise muttered, her voice trembling as she stared at her plate. We were told they were a week away from collapse. But look at this. They are drowning in butter. The sensory immersion was the final blow to their ideology. The sound of the wind through the corn, the smell of the frying oil, the feel of the soft, RICH soil beneath their boots. It all spoke a language that propaganda couldn't translate. They realized that the Reich hadn't just lost the war. It had never truly understood what it was up against. They were fighting a nation that didn't just have an army, but an ecosystem of abundance. As the afternoon wore on, Helga stood at the edge of the Schmidt's property, looking out toward the horizon. The cornfield stretched as far as her eyes could see, vanishing into the shimmering heat haze. It was infinite. She realized that every ear of corn was a bullet, every tractor was a tank, and every satisfied farmer was a soldier. She turned to see one of the American guards leaning against the truck, chewing on a piece of straw, looking bored. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't a conqueror. He was just a boy who wanted to go back to a farm just like this one. Helga felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief, not for her country, but for the lie she had lived. She had been taught that strength was found in iron and blood. But standing in the middle of that Kansas cornfield, she knew the truth. Real strength was found in the ability to feed your enemies until they forgot why they hated you. As they were loaded back onto the trucks to return to the camp, the women were silent. The mockery was gone. The arrogance was gone. They clutched small handfuls of dried corn kernels in their pockets, like forbidden's religious relics. They weren't just prisoners of war anymore. They were prisoners of a new reality. They had seen the sunary golden power of the prairie, and they knew that when they finally went home to the ruins of Germany, they would be carrying a secret that would change their families forever. The corn was no longer animal feed. It was the taste of a future they weren't sure they deserved. The war didn't end with a bang for the women of Camp Concordia. It ended with the hollow, crackling silence of a radio broadcast. The 1,000-year Reich was gone, reduced to a pile of smoking ash and broken promises. As the day of repatriation approached, the atmosphere in the camp shifted from rigid discipline to a strange morning transition. Helga and her comrades were no longer the elite officers of a global superpower. They were the daughters of a defeated, starving nation that had lost its soul. On their final morning, the American guards did something that would remain etched in their hearts long after the barbed wire had rusted away. They didn't offer medals, and they didn't give grand speeches. Instead, they handed each woman a small, heavy burlap sack. Inside was a treasure more valuable than gold: dried sweet corn kernels and finely ground cornmeal. It was a parting gift from the land of plenty to the land of ruins. As Helga stepped onto the train that would begin her long journey back across a shattered Europe, she clutched that sack to her chest like a living thing. She traveled through a landscape that looked like a graveyard. When she finally reached the skeletal remains of Berlin, the sweet scent of the Kansas prairie was replaced by the suffocating stench of burnt rubber and despair. She found her family home partially collapsed. Her mother sat in the shadows, a ghost of her former self, surviving on watery soup made of boiled grass and desperation. Helga didn't say a word. She walked into the cold kitchen, cleared the rubble from the stove, and lit a small fire using the splinters of a broken chair. She opened her burlap sack. She carefully mixed the golden cornmeal with a little water and the tiny bit of salt she had saved. As the heat hit the pan, the aroma began to change the room. The smoky, sweet scent of cornbread began to rise, drifting through the cracks in the walls. Her mother began to tremble. Then she started to cry. It was the first time she had smelled something that smelled like life in years. "It is animal food, Helga," her mother whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of the propaganda that had been hammered into her brain for a lifetime. "Why are you cooking cattle feed?" Helga broke off a steaming, golden piece of the bread and placed it gently in her mother's shaking hand. She looked her mother in the eyes with a clarity that only a prisoner of truth can have. "No, Mother," Helga said, her voice firm and thick with a bittersweet realization. "This is not animal food. This is the reason we lost the war. And it is the only reason we are going to survive the peace." The final paradox was the most powerful of all. The very crop they had mocked as pig fodder became the foundation of their rebirth. The iron of the Reich had failed, but the golden grain of the enemy had brought the dead back to life. The greatest weapon in the history of warfare wasn't a bomb, it was a seed.